You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm chatting with Allison Zinder, a culinary educator and tour guide in Paris. She's here to explore the many categories of eatery on the Parisian culinary landscape, by way of a word that is sometimes a reference to dehydrated stock, but not always. Bouillon. Welcome back, Allison, to the podcast. For those who didn't tune in to Allison's first episode on the word gastronomie and gastronomique, well, first of all, what are you doing? And secondly, can you tell us a little bit, Allison, just a little bit more about who you are and what you do here in Paris?
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for having me back on your podcast. I'm really excited to talk about Bouillon today. But what do I do? Let's see. I am a gastronomy guide, so I lead English-speaking travelers through Paris on market tours, restaurant history tour. I also do a Belleville history tour, which is a little bit about food, but more about Belleville, which is my favorite area of Paris. I also run 2 study abroad programs with American universities. One of them just ended a couple weeks ago. It's called Food and Culture of France. And that's great because the students spend 3 weeks just tasting French food and learning about French food and culture. And let's see, I'm also head of academics at a restaurant and hotel management school. That pretty much fills up my schedule, all that stuff. So there you go.
Yeah, you're a busy lady, and those trips are pretty idyllic.
Yes.
So, well, I'm really excited to have you back on the podcast today to chat about one of our favorite, but I know one of your favorite topics, which is bouillon. And I think, any non-French speakers who are listening right now might be familiar with this word from bouillon cubes. And I'm wondering, is that a false friend? Is that, is there a link there at all? Or have we just, made this up? Where does bouillon, as we're going to talk about it, have any link to a little bouillon cube?
It certainly does, of course, but I have to laugh because of that bouillon cube. I was traveling in Western Africa many, many years ago, and the family that I was staying with, they were preparing fish one day, and they were chopping up a bunch of herbs and putting everything in this huge, like mortar and pestle. I mean, you had to stand to use it, and it smelled good. And then the fish, it was just lovely. And I said, what is your secret? And they said, magie. And I was like, wow, magic. Like, wow, that sounds so cool. And I realized, of course, that what they were talking about, what they were referring to was Maggie bouillon cube that they would crush up and put with all the spices and everything else. And I thought, okay, all right, just like come back down to earth, Allison. This is not magic. This is bouillon cube. It's true that a lot of people still use bouillon cubes, even in France. But
which just 1 second, I'm going to interrupt you there because I feel like that is something that this is a like my eternal soapbox that I refuse to get off of. So I'm going to stand on it for 1 second, which is that everybody has this assumption that France is like stuck in some like idyllic Trente Glorieuses, like, everybody makes their bouillon from scratch. And, I have never seen more bouillon cubes than I have since I've moved to France. People use them all the time.
Yes, and it is true. And I have to say that there has been an evolution in bouillon cubes, going from magie, what they call here, Maggie, to what we have nowadays, which of course you have the organic bouillon cubes, and you can actually read the ingredients and actually pronounce all of the ingredients. And that's totally fine. But there has never really been in stores here, like you have in the United States, for example, like chicken stock, like in a box that's already like it's liquid. Here, you either have bouillon cubes or you can go to Piaf, which until pretty recently had stock that you could buy, chicken stock in little frozen cubes, but it was the real thing. They had chicken, they had veal, and now they just have some kind of mix of both. And so I don't buy that anymore. And I just make my own. But French people, by and large, are not at home stirring the stock pot for hours on end. That's not realistic for people's lifestyle. So yeah, that, is also part of, I like to step on that soapbox as well, because it's not, and even restaurateurs, and we can get into this when we're talking about routier a little bit later, but even restaurateurs are often using like chef brand, like powdered bouillon that comes in a package. They're not making their own stocks anymore. And I'm not talking about like, gastronomic restaurants or even bistros, but by and large, restaurateurs here are using these products that are, obviously probably not cheaper to buy, but cheaper in terms of labor because they don't take very, very much time. You just add water kind of thing. So anyway, that's a whole other discussion though.
Absolutely. And I've made us deviate. So, okay, let's bring it back. Let's bring it back. So what's the link then between bouillon cubes and bouillon the way that we want to talk about it today, which is a style, but I mean, it's a place where you eat, right?
Yes,
Okay.
totally. So we know it's a place where you eat, but why? So bouillon, between the bouillon cube, which we know nowadays, and basically bouillon is just broth. I mean, it's the French word for broth, okay? So it's a word that's sort of come back into vogue because when we talk about broth or bouillon in French, it's basically a very light stock. We can make it using either raw meat or like cooked meat, like a carcass of a chicken. It's not going to cook for a very long time. It's something that you're going to use either. You could use it to make a sauce, but you're often going to maybe just drink a bowl of bouillon. And I'll get into that in a minute, but it doesn't have a whole lot of body the way, like, for example, a stock does, or even a bone broth. Bone broth is this whole other realm, but really it's just rebranded stock. I mean, bone broth has become very fashionable lately because, of course, it uses these roasted bones. It's simmered for a really, really long time. But whether you're talking about bone broth or stock, what you're talking about is extracting all of the sort of collagen. That's what gives you that gelatinous sort of texture when you're going to refrigerate your stock or bone broth. And it's a much denser liquid. It's a base for sauces. I mean, French cuisine is known for its sauces. I mean, even Alexandre Dumas in his Grand Dictionnaire de la Cuisine said that French cuisine owes its superiority to the excellence of its bouillon. But really, what he was referring to is stock. But those terms can be interchangeable. Stock is going to be, that denser base for sauces, and it cooks a lot longer to extract the collagen. Same thing with a bone broth, okay? So bone broth, very fashionable terminology, but really just glorified stock. So that's kind of important to know. Bouillon, forever and ever and ever, has always been like this hospital remedy. Even if you think of it now, like, I mean, I don't know about your childhood, but my childhood, we still had this sort of idea that, like, oh, if you're sick, you stay in bed and you sip, chicken bouillon or chicken broth. Your mom's going to make you chicken noodle soup or.
Sure. Jewish penicillin, right?
Exactly. Totally. So, I mean, that's really the idea of, like this idea that the bouillon is going to be served in hospitals, for example. I mean, it was very much, convalescent food, getting over a hangover. You've got all kinds of sort of hangover soups like, French onion soup is one of them. It was known as the drunkard's soup because it gets you through a hangover.
And still in France, yeah.
Yes, it's served at weddings, like the kind of weddings where you're going to be like all weekend in a chateau kind of thing and staying over for 2 days. And they serve it at 4 a.m., drinking, dancing, and then a kick in the butt to go to bed is the French onion soup that's going to be served at 4 a.m. and hopefully help you with your hangover the next day. But even, I mean, throughout all the areas of France, you've got this sort of hangover soup that's made with tons of garlic and then, or even just the garlic that you're going to, you open the clove and just like scratch it over a piece of toast and then put it down on the bottom of your chicken broth and then maybe put a fried egg over it or something, just basically all of those are sort of convalescent kind of soup to give you, what used to be called this mysterious sensation of well-being and comfort, very sort of a restorative, a medicinal restorative. But somehow along the way, so these medical prescriptions, for example, like the hospital bouillon, became gourmet foods because it was very, fashionable. It became very fashionable from 1765, let's say, to eat bouillon or to drink it in a small sort of cafe environment. And basically, I mean, any of those broths or bouillon could be made from, beef or poultry, hen, rooster, whatever, but also turtles or frogs. I mean, those were some more exotic meats. Yeah, I guess at that time, those were the other white meats, unlike pork is today. And so actually, bouillon or restaurant gave us the word restaurant. So that, it sort of puts you back into a normal state or it gets you back on your feet kind of thing. And so basically in 1765, the first official restaurant that opened, or at least what they called a restaurant at the time, was opened by Mr. Chantoiseau, or otherwise known as Boulanger, which is totally confusing because, of course, he's not a baker. That was just his name. But anyway, so he served these sort of broths, restorative broths, and Then he got into trouble a little bit later on because he started serving other dishes that were sort of out of the realm of bouillon, kind of like stews and things like that. So that's another
Okay.
story for another day. But
Well, yeah, hold on. Because to understand where we are now, just really briefly, because I feel like there's this landscape happening on the Parisian dining scene in the 18th century that like you have, Chantoiseau, but then you have like other places where you can eat. And like, I always say this on my tours and people laugh, like the French love to make rules about their food. But I really feel like we need to understand like some of the rules that are governing the dining landscape at the time. Like there's different categories of places where you can eat different things, right? When you're saying he got into trouble.
yes. And basically all of that was related to the whole like guild system that they had in, I guess, from starting maybe about the 15th century. Don't quote me on that, but it might have been even earlier. But these guilds were basically like brotherhoods, and they sort of ruled what could be called, for example, a charcutier, what a charcutier could make and sell. They ruled what a butcher could make and sell. And there were also these different, sort of types of restaurants, I want to say. There were taverns, which were mainly places to drink, and then you could eat there, but it wasn't portioned. And this is what the guild of cook caterers was making. So it wasn't portioned. So you kind of sit down at a table, with other people that you probably would know. And then you all share a huge joint of meat, for example, that's on the table. And then you had like an auberge or an inn where only one single dish is going to be on offer. And that you definitely had common tables. And then to go back to these traiteurs or cook caterers who were running the taverns in some cases, they could also sell sauces and stews. And this is where Chantoiseau got into big trouble, hot water or hot bouillon, hot stew, as you like, because he started making a sheep's foot stew that he was selling in his little first estaminet cafe restaurant. Okay. So of course he was sued by the guilds, by the guild association. And then it kind of was a moot point anyway after 1789 because the guild system completely dissolved. Some people like to attribute it specifically to the French Revolution, but that's kind of an easy, jump from one thing to the other. And of course it had a lot to do with this increasingly complex system that, would say that, I don't know, the cook caterers could sell pastries, like filled meat pastries, but then like who was actually making the pastry? Well, it had to be a pastry cook. So how did they work that out? And then some people could only sell vinegar. Some people, you would want to sell mustard because you were selling maybe roast pork, but you weren't allowed to sell mustard because that was the realm of someone, another guild. So it got really it was just really arcane, like hair splitting rules. So, that kind of just went the way of the dodo bird after the French Revolution.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, the Terroir Podcast, co-hosted by me, Emily, and Caroline Connor of Wine Dine Caroline. Each week, we take a deep dive into the food, wine, and more of a different region in France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. But then even today, you have you have in Paris, like places that are bouillons and places that are bistros and places that are restaurants and places that are cafes and brasseries and wine bars.
Yes, it's so confusing.
Can you split those hairs for us? Like what was the difference? And is the difference today in 2022 still the difference that it was in 1765?
Okay, well, let's go back to the bouillon. So basically the bouillon was, from 1765, this very sort of chic kind of place for sort of wealthier people who were going to a restaurant to sit at an individual marble top table. They had menus. This was the very first thing. So the bouillon nowadays has become this very, very working class kind of restaurant. But that didn't start until about 1860. So this guy named Pierre-Louis Duval was a butcher. He basically opened the first bouillon that was for basically working class people. Yeah, 1860, he opened it near Les Halles Central Marketplace. This was a wholesale marketplace where people would work all night. And then when they finished their shift at 6 a.m., 8 a.m., whatever, they would go get this nourishing bouillon or broth to send them off to bed. And basically, Duval was really, really smart because he had wealthy clients from the butcher shop, but they weren't interested in eating the sort of variety meats or the pieces of meat that weren't very tender. And so he decided to make money from those by opening up this sort of working man's restaurant. It was kind of like the fast food restaurant of the day. And so he could use those other cuts of meat. And then his son created several bouillon restaurants. So it actually became this kind of chain. And the only one left nowadays, and I'm going to talk about this one later, is called Julien, which opened in 1906. And Julien has actually come back to the bouillon name, but not before basically going through all these other iterations of types of restaurants. So we can talk about that in a minute. But so Bouillon today is either this very sort of traditional working class kind of restaurant with really, really low prices. I mean, that's the main thing, is that the prices are really low. That's what's going to separate a Bouillon from most other type of eating establishment in Paris. You do also have the neo bouillon, which a little bit like a neo bistro, which I'll mention, are the bouillon that are open nowadays, but that are going to be a little bit trendier in terms of responsible sourcing of their ingredients. So, for example, I don't want to actually mention any names, but if you go to the most sort of traditional bouillon in Paris, the one that's been open the longest, you will get a basic like egg mayonnaise. That's it. It's very basic. I'm not sure if the eggs are even boiled on site. They might come actually in a big sort of plastic bucket of eggs and those come from the factory. I don't know what the quality of their eggs is. However, if you go into what we call a neo bouillon, one that has opened up since like 2018, let's say, they're going to put on their menu that they have organic eggs, and they might even tell you where they come from. And they're going to make their mayonnaise from, organic eggs as well. So, and they might even add like a truffle kind of kick into it. And so that's going to be a little bit more attractive to a younger generation that is looking for more responsible sourcing in terms of ingredients.
Okay, cool.
If that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense. So the bouillon then is kind of this working class, inexpensive, you said from the 19th century.
Yeah.
Working class, inexpensive, there's certain dishes that you can expect to see, like this œuf maillot situation.
Yes.
Where does that stand out from historically, let's say, the bistro?
Bistro, actually, just to sort of give you a basic timeline, bistro dates from 1814, we'll say. There is, according to legend, and now how much truth there is to it, I'm not sure. According to legend, the Russians, when they were occupying Paris around 1814, that era, they would actually go to these eating establishments and where they weren't supposed to be. So they didn't want to be seen there. So they would always be telling the waiters to hurry, hurry. And that's why they would use this word bistro, which meant hurry, hurry, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because they wanted to get in and out as quickly as possible without being seen. Now, whether that is just the realm of legend, probably some truth to it, probably truth that has been embellished. That's about the date that we put on bistros, 1814. The bouillon, I like to call it the bouillon chic, or a little bit expensive, from 1765. Sorry, that needed to go before bistro, of course. That was Chantoiseau's version of the bouillon chic. The bouillon populaire, which I call it, meaning the working class bouillon, didn't come along until 1860 with the Duval family. And then we have another type of restaurant coming a little bit later, 1876, brasserie. And the brasserie came about from all the Alsatians coming to Paris after, during the Franco-Prussian War, and sort of Alsace going back to Germany. And so the Alsatians were like, let's get out of here. Let's go to Paris and try our luck. We're going to open up a restaurant in Paris. So those brasseries are usually going to be sort of focused around Alsatian food, especially like sauerkraut with all the different, sausages and things, and beer. So that's another traditional type of restaurant that you find in Paris, of course.
So we had all of these different restaurants kind of like popping up in different places and from different like types of founders, right? Because you're talking about the Alsatians. I think there's the Auvergnat as well, are pretty instrumental in adding a certain type of restaurant to Paris.
I think the Auvergnat for me are more like about cafes.
Cafes, okay.
I mean, you could check me on that.
No, I think you're right. Right. Okay, so we have all of these different categories of restaurants that are kind of appearing at different times throughout Paris. And today, you walk down any boulevard and you're going to see like cafe such and such, bistro so and so, Bouillon, what's her face, and brasserie, who's my face. So, Dubois. But, I mean, I when I first moved here, I was sort of always people would ask me, what's the difference? And sometimes you'd hear like, oh, well, cafes do service continu, for example. They don't close between the noontime meal and the evening meal. Or like, wine bars can serve alcohol, but only if you get food with it. But the reality, as far as it seems to me, but I'm looking for you to correct me. I love being corrected when I'm wrong, is like that there isn't, that difference seems to have been eroded a little bit. Is that sort of the way that you perceive things?
Oh, completely. It's a big mess. It's really hard to sort of explain to people, and even for French people, because you could ask 10 French people, 10 Parisians, true Parisians, and you got to find 10, first of all, people born and bred in Paris, what the differences are between these different establishments. And everyone is going to have a different definitions of, well, Bouillon is a bit more specific, bistro as well. But the differences between like cafes, wine bars, restaurants, I mean, what the heck? It's very confusing. And this has to do with the historical differences that, the evolution of these different establishments over time has a lot to do, first of all, with different fashions in Paris, what was fashionable at a different time. Even, for example, I'm digressing a little bit, but you could have one single establishment in Paris, for example, that was, formerly sort of a guinguette, like a bar. And then when that was popular, and then later on, it became maybe like a music hall and theater, because that's what the popular form of entertainment was at the time. Then, coming up into the 1940s, 1950s, the establishment became a movie theater because that's what was really popular at the time. And then finally, it just became a bar. So, you have these evolutions when it comes to restaurants as well. I'll give you the example of Bouillon Julien. That's its name now. I mentioned it earlier, opened in 1906. It was the true, it was part of that true first chain of Bouillon restaurants. Now, we'd like to say that these working man's restaurants or working person's restaurants were popular at that time. But when you go into Bouillon Julien nowadays, you see that the decor is absolutely gorgeous. It's got this really beautiful Art Nouveau decor, which, if I remember correctly, came after it was originally opened as a Bouillon. Because if you think about it, like working class people going into a, sort of a cheap, what the equivalent of a fast food restaurant was at the time, they weren't going into these really, really fancy Art Nouveau restaurants, as far as I'm concerned. They would have had a pretty basic decor. So I think their decor came along a little bit later because it's absolutely spectacular. I definitely recommend it. But Julien became a restaurant at some point, and then it was known even as a brasserie. So actually, if you look at, you can even just look up Bouillon Julien, Wikipedia. It says something like, Bouillon Julien is a restaurant originally opened as a bouillon and is a type of brasserie. I mean, that's literally what it says. And I'm like, okay, so if the French don't even know what it is, how, what hope is there for foreigners who are living here to understand the differences between these places? But so for a long time, Bouillon Julien was known just as basically a restaurant, or even Brasserie Julien, because it was run by the Flo Group, which is part of the Alsatian brasserie family named Flaudereur that came to Paris. And you can still actually go to Flaudereur Brasserie, which is just around the corner from Bouillon Julien. But I mean, it's really confusing. I'll give you another example. Café de la Paix, just next to the Opera House. Café de la Paix is a cafe where you can eat breakfast, but they also have a restaurant. But the restaurant is also called Café de la Paix. And that restaurant is actually, well, they're tending towards, let's say, classic French gastronomy. Like you're going to be able to get a Dover sole there where the server is going to come over and basically, take the fillets of the sole off of the bones for you at tableside, very sort of classic technique for a French restaurant. So it's just very, very difficult. Wine bars, they're going to be really concentrated on obviously the wine. The food isn't secondary, but it is in many places. And then the bistro, of course, where you're going to have a pretty limited menu, kind of almost like, the old fashioned bistro is almost like a mom and pop kind of place, red and white checkered tablecloths. Nowadays, they're probably made out of paper instead of cloth, and that's fine. And then the neo bistro, which again, a little bit like the neo bouillon, is going to be more focused on responsibly sourced ingredients and a sort of a real marketing effort. Now, that's sort of my second point, answering your question about when did this all get so mixed up? And I think a lot of what is going on nowadays, or most of what's going on nowadays, has to do with marketing. And again, it kind of goes back to that idea where you had an establishment sort of going along with the different fashionable forms of entertainment throughout the different time periods. The same with restaurants. As maybe brasserie became more popular, a restaurant would change its name and become a brasserie. And that didn't mean that they weren't changing the menu. Of course, they would, serve maybe the token sauerkraut with sausages if they were calling themselves a brasserie, because you can't have an Alsatian brasserie without serving sauerkraut. But, they sort of changed with the times. And I think that has a lot to do with what we now call marketing, of course. I mean, marketing has always existed, but we just didn't call it that. Same thing with, bistros. Neo bistro, it's going to have a menu that's going to correspond to maybe younger people's tastes, because they're going to have sort of organic ingredients as opposed to sort of the old fashioned kind of or bistro. And so there you are.
Amazing.
Sorry.
I mean, no, but it's such a weird combination and coalescence of all of these different places. And I think what you put your finger on this sort of return, this trend of the neo bistro, the neo bouillon. And, we talked a little bit about bistronomie in the gastronomique episode, so we won't linger too long on that. Anybody who's interested in learning more about bistronomie should definitely check out Allison's first episode. But we have seen, because we're having this renewed interest in classic French food. And that is something where I get a lot of people coming from the States asking me, where is your favorite bistro in Paris? And I have to tell them it's really hard to find a good classic bistro these days. But there are places like Bouillon Pigalle, like Bouillon République, that are doing a really fantastic job at kind of reclaiming some of that ancestral French food.
Yes.
But one weird side effect that I've noticed of that is that there are two kind of categories of restaurant. And of course, construing all of these things as restaurants is, again, because it was historically a different category, but an eatery, right? There are two traditional French eateries that have come to Paris that don't really belong here. So the bouchon and the routier, right?
Yes.
So neither of those belongs in Paris. Why?
To me, the bouchon is just very specifically the traditional Lyonnaise or Lyonnais restaurant. It comes from Lyon. And I feel like, okay, that's cool. We have Corsican restaurants in Paris. We have Italian restaurants in Paris. We have Southwest of France, of course, focused restaurants in Paris. We have Tex-Mex restaurants in Paris. Why not the Bouchon or the Lyonnais style restaurant? I mean, sure, why not? I don't frequent them because I would prefer to eat in a Bouchon when I go to Lyon, because it's traditionally, Lyonnaise or Lyonnais. So, I mean, that's just a choice. But it's basically a theme restaurant.
Right.
I mean, I would put it in the category of a theme restaurant. Same thing with the routier. Now, the routier, I have a problem with seeing a routier in Paris because it's really disingenuous. It doesn't even make any sense. A routier is a truck stop. I mean, that's what it's always sort of existed as. In fact, I was chefing at a truck stop many, many years ago. And I mean, it really was the kind of place where at 12:01, about 80, truck drivers, garbage picker-uppers, all kinds of working guys, and they were all men. They would, stomp in, get mud all over the restaurant floor, and that's okay. That wasn't my job to clean it up, thank God. But they were coming because there was this very typical routier or truck stop kind of fixed menu, which basically was an hors d'oeuvre or let's say a first course buffet where you had grated carrot salad, you had celery root salad, you had all the different kind of potato salads, like the Piemontaise. You had the Macédoine, which is like a mixed vegetable salad, just drowning in mayonnaise, the way they like to do it in the truck stops. It's not fancy food. I mean, the menu, the set menu would be like €9, €10. I mean, this was a while ago. Nowadays, it'd probably be about 14. But still, you're getting entrée, first course, plat, main course, and dessert, for this price, and a coffee. Okay. And probably a glass of rosé or a glass of wine, whatever you're going to drink, probably red wine. But, it's very, very cheap food. We would typically have like 2 dishes, 2 main courses of the day, and that's it, and then maybe 3 different desserts. But one of the main courses would be like, beef tongue in spicy sauce or, really cheap cuts of meat. It was, very, very cheap. And so the idea of having a truck stop in Paris, well, as far as I know, I mean, truckers, actually my neighbor's a trucker. He does not eat at the restaurant that's called Routier here in Paris. And I don't know. I mean, it's okay, but I think that the restaurant would probably be just as good, if not better, if they didn't advertise themselves as a routier, as a truck stop. I think it's just a little bit disingenuous. But yeah, that's my opinion.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Romancing in Paris, which delves into love, lust, and so much more in the City of Light. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. So I'm going to ask you now the question that I get asked all the time, and I'm going to put you on the spot here because I didn't prep you for it, but we're going to see what you're able to come up with.
Oh, God.
So like when it comes to classic French food, people are constantly asking me, well, what are your favorite bistros? And I'm like, okay, I know what you mean, right? I'm not going to be deliberately obtuse the way the French often are when you ask them questions. I'm going to try and understand what you mean, which is where can I eat traditional, authentic, delicious French food? And interpret that question however you want to interpret it. Where would you send someone if you wanted them to get, what feels like a classic French experience, but that doesn't feel like you're sitting in a museum eating museum relics?
Okay. Now, my answer to that question changes with the weather. And honestly, it was sunny this morning and now it's a little bit gray. So my answer could have changed from between this morning and now. Mm-hmm. But the first thing that comes to mind is a place that I took my study abroad students to. Typically, we go there. I send travelers, other people there because it's not expensive. The last really good, typically French meal that wasn't fussy, I had at Bouillon République.
Love it there.
Yeah, Bouillon République kind of reunites, kind of brings together all of the different things that I like about eating in French restaurants. It's beautiful on the inside. It was actually, again, another example of this sort of mishmash of genre of restaurant is, it was traditionally a brasserie, an Alsatian brasserie called Chez Jenny, which, us old timers in Paris know about. So Chez Jenny closed and then Bouillon République opened in its place. So they do serve sauerkraut and they have a couple of nods to that, Alsatian, brasserie tradition. The decor on the inside is absolutely gorgeous. It's a little bit dim. It's a little bit dark. It's absolutely huge. It is enormous and it's very loud, which is kind of a thing that I like about French restaurants or that type of French restaurant anyway. It's very convivial. You're kind of sitting elbow to elbow with people that you don't know on these sort of long, long tables, which could be divided or not. They've got booths. And what I like about their menu is that there's really something for everyone. They've got seasonal foods. They had a nice white asparagus with a sort of mousseline sauce last time I was there. And their mousseline version is mayonnaise with a little bit of whipped cream into it. Not sweet whipped cream, obviously, but just crème montée. Anyway, there are other better ways to make mousseline, but this is the cheap way of making mousseline. This is the way that French people cooking at home are going to make a mousseline with the mayonnaise and a little bit of whipped cream. They're not going to go through all the steps of this fussy old-fashioned French sauce to make the mousseline. Okay. So, it really represents, I think, the best of French cooking that is sort of on a budget because, like I said, it does, it's not very expensive, but they do have, they're the ones who serve the œuf maillot, egg with mayonnaise with truffles in the mayonnaise, and so it's a little bit gussied up in terms of what compared to the traditional bouillon, but it's good. They have good products. It's not expensive and it's a great atmosphere. What else? What am I missing? The wines. The wines, well, they're not going to be, there's not going to be like a 20-page wine list. I mean, that's for sure. But, it's convivial. You're not going there for this rarefied sort of like museum-like hushed, reverential experience like you have in very high-end gastronomic restaurants in Paris. And that's a good thing in some ways. I'm not bashing Michelin-star restaurants because I love those experiences. But I think for a sort of a fun, and good qualitative experience, to me, that represents the best that Paris has to offer at the moment. But, like I said, if it starts, if there's a rain shower tonight, I'll change my mind, so.
I love it. Allison, thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking us on this journey through the convoluted culinary landscape of Paris.
Sure.
Part of its charm, right?
Yes. Emily, thank you so much.
Where can people find you?
Oh, yeah. People can find me at AllisonZinder.com. That's my website, and it kind of just like sort of brings together all my different activities. People can contact me through the contact page on that website, AllisonZinder.com. And thank you again, Emily. This has been fun. I love talking about this stuff, and you're the best person to pick my brain about all of these things. So you do such a good job. It's awesome.
Oh, thank you. Well, anyone who enjoyed this conversation might enjoy taking one of Allison's fantastic tours through Paris. So check out her website and book her in, and she'll regale you with even more stories and awesome archival photos and all that wonderful nerdy stuff we love here at Navigating the French. So thank you so much, Allison. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emily.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.